So you want to buy a horse stable. Most people think owning a stable means living out a romantic fantasy. Rolling green pastures, morning mist, the smell of hay, and grateful clients who adore their horses, and, by extension, adore you. You imagined yourself walking the grounds in a Barber jacket, maybe hosting the occasional show, maybe giving a few lessons on weekends to people who will write you 5-star reviews about how you changed their lives. Of course, you have the money for all of this. You're not here to ask if you can afford it. You're here to find out if it's worth it. It isn't what you think. Here's the thing about the equestrian industry that nobody mentions at the barn. The money isn't in the horses. A full-care boarding client who pays you $1,200 a month, and you will need many of them, generates, after feed, bedding, labor, manure disposal, farrier coordination, and the non-stop low-grade infrastructure crisis that is owning 40 acres of anything, somewhere between zero and a modest lunch. The stalls are the loss leader. The stable is just the vehicle. What actually makes the money is something most first-time buyers never even ask about before they sign. And then there's the dark side, an industry scandal so grotesque and so specific to the equestrian world that the FBI spent 2 decades quietly building a case while people at the very top of the sport pretended not to notice. It cost at least one of America's most celebrated horse farms its entire legacy, its $127 million debt load, and its most famous horse. By the end of this, you'll know exactly what a stable costs to get into, where the real money comes from, and why the people who've lost everything in this business almost always made the exact same 2 mistakes. So let's start where every dream starts, with the price tag. The first thing to understand is that buying a horse stable is really buying real estate with a very expensive livestock problem attached to it. Prices range from modest to absurd, and the tier you enter at determines almost everything about how much you'll actually work. At the entry level, you're looking at a small rural boarding facility, 5 to 15 stalls, a few paddocks, maybe a modest outdoor arena. Properties like this, think a functional 10-stall setup on 10 acres somewhere in the Mid-South or the Plain States, list in the $500,000 to $1.2 million range. For around $800,000, you can pick up a workable operation with a good indoor riding ring in areas like Ohio or central Pennsylvania. What you're getting is the bones of a business. You'll have boarders. You might turn a small profit by year 3 if you fill every stall and live on the property to cut labor costs. This is the option for someone who has run a barn before and has realistic expectations. Of the people who buy at this tier without prior experience, a meaningful number sell within 5 years. The mid-market tier is where things get genuinely interesting. A legitimate 30 to 50 stall facility with an indoor arena, covered wash stalls, a tack room, outdoor rings, and enough acreage to run a lesson program runs $2.5 million to $5 million in most competitive equestrian markets. In 2025, a 63-acre dressage and training estate in western Howard County, Maryland, First Choice Farm, with elite-level competition facilities, listed for $5.75 million. In Lenexa, Kansas, the largest equestrian facility in the Kansas City area, 84 stalls, 140 acres, 2 heated indoor arenas with surround sound, solar panels on the roof, and a greenhouse, listed at $7.84 million. These are real businesses, not hobby farms. At this level, you're not the one cleaning stalls. You're managing the people who clean stalls, which is a different and equally punishing job. And then, as promised, the price tags start getting silly. At the top of the market, you're buying properties where the horses are almost beside the point. Kalili Stables in Bridgehampton, New York, a 19.2-acre equestrian compound where Ralph Lauren held his spring 2025 fashion show for 250 guests, including the First Lady and Anna Wintour, went on the market for $15.25 million. The seller had paid $14 million for it in 2021. The same property had originally listed at $40 million in 2017. In Hampton's equestrian real estate, as in all Hampton's real estate, the number on the stall door is not really the point. Now, before you write the check for any of these tiers, here's what nobody warns you about. First, zoning. Buying a horse property and running a commercial boarding facility are 2 entirely different legal acts. In most U.S. counties, If you want to board more than 5 or 6 horses that aren't yours, you need a conditional use permit or a special use permit from your local planning commission, a process that runs 2 to 6 months and costs anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 in fees before a single horse walks through your gate. In Sonoma County, California, group lessons, clinics, and horse shows require a use permit on top of the boarding permit. In Weld County, Colorado, boarding more than 5 non-resident horses on A1 agricultural land requires its own separate approval. And if your facility sits anywhere near residential zones, expect setback requirements of 150 to 300 feet from neighboring houses, noise restrictions on your outdoor arenas, and a mandatory manure management plan filed with the county. Second, the building permits. Stalls must be at least 10 feet by 10 feet, ideally 12 by 12. Ceiling heights run to 14 feet in riding arenas. Ventilation standards are specified by NFPA 150. That's the National Fire Protection Association's code specifically for animal housing, which exists because hay, bedding, sawdust, and electrical wiring inside a wooden building is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Current construction costs for a basic 4-stall center aisle barn run $150 per square foot. A quality 20-stall barn with an attached indoor arena runs $400,000 to $700,000 to build from scratch. Buying an existing facility is currently 20 to 30% cheaper than building new. Do not build new. Third, and most important, the insurance stack. A standard farm policy doesn't cover a boarding stable. You need general liability, covering the people who fall off horses on your property. You need care, custody, and control insurance, covering the horses you don't own that die or get injured in your barn. You need professional liability for your instructors, and you need property coverage for a barn full of combustible material. Add it up for a 30-stall facility, and you're looking at $12,000 to $20,000 a year in insurance before you've bought a single bale of hay. The good news, and there is actually good news here, is that 48 U.S. states have passed equine activity liability acts, laws that limit your exposure when someone gets injured during a normal equine activity. The states that have not passed this law? California and Maryland. Both are among the most desirable equestrian markets in the country. Of course. So why would anyone in their right mind go through all of this? Because the people who understand this business know something that the people who dream about it don't. The stalls are not the product. Let me explain what I mean. The naive assumption about a boarding stable is that you make money by housing horses. You charge $1,200 a month per stall, you fill 30 stalls, that's $36,000 a month, and at some point after expenses you pocket something. That math is not wrong. Exactly. But it treats the boarder like an endpoint. The people who actually profit in this industry treat the boarder as a door. Here's what a boarding client is actually worth. They pay you $1,200 a month for full care board, stall, turnout, hay, grain, daily cleaning. That's the base. But a boarder who keeps their horse at your facility also needs someone to ride that horse 4 days a week while they're at work. That's training at $500 to $1,500 a month per horse on top of board. They also need lessons because if they're paying for a horse, they want to ride it well. At $65 to $90 per session, once or twice a week. That's another $1,000 to $1,400 a month. Their kid wants lessons too. Their friend wants lessons. The friend wants to board. The friend's friend is flying in from Connecticut for a clinic in October and needs a stall for 4 days. You charge haul-in rates for that. This is what the industry calls the sticky ecosystem. The technical term is something drier, but that's what it is. A boarder who is also a lesson client generates 2 to 3 times the revenue of a boarder who only boards. And a boarder in a lesson program churns at a fraction of the rate of one who isn't, which matters enormously when every empty stall still costs you the same in fixed overhead, whether it's occupied or not. Let's run the single customer math. A client boards their horse at your facility for $1,200 a month. They take 2 lessons a week at $75 each, $600 a month. Their horse goes into training 3 days a week at $800 a month. They buy their hay from you in bulk. You mark it up $40 a bale over your cost, and their horse eats roughly 1 bale every 4 days. That's another $300 a month in margin. Total monthly revenue from one client, $2,900. Total monthly cost to service them, hay, bedding, labor, that's roughly $600 to $700. Net contribution per client, around $2,200. Multiply that across 25 clients at a 25-stall facility, and you're looking at $55,000 a month in net contribution before facility costs. That's what a real equestrian business looks like when it's running properly. Now, what's the real machine? It's not the stall, it's the lesson program. The industry data is consistent on this. Stables that generate more than 40% of their revenue from services beyond basic boarding, lessons, training, clinics, events, camps, consistently outperform boarding-only facilities on margin by 5 to 10 percentage points. The stalls get the horses in the door. The lesson program is where the economics actually work. There's one more revenue stream the brochure never mentions. Successful stables in agricultural zones can sometimes sell manure, composted to local nurseries and garden centers, or raw to nearby farms, generating a few hundred to a few $1,000s a month from something they'd otherwise pay to dispose of. You are, in a very literal sense, in the business of turning horse waste into money, which is, when you think about it, a reasonable summary of the entire equestrian industry. Now you know where the money comes from. Here's where it goes. The operating cost structure of a horse stable is designed, at first glance, to seem manageable. A few staff, some hay, the usual. Here's what it actually looks like for a 30-stall full-service facility in a mid-market location. Payroll is the number that always shocks people first. You need a barn manager, the person who runs everything when you're not there, and sometimes when you are. Call it $45,000 to $60,000 a year. You need a head trainer or instructor, $50,000 to $70,000, plus a percentage of lesson revenue. You need 2 to 3 stable hands for daily feeding, stall cleaning, turnout, and the endless category of things that break. Gates, waterers, fencing. That one hinge that goes every 3 months. At $14 to $18 an hour, figure $75,000 to $100,000 a year for the barn team. Add payroll taxes, workers' comp, and the occasional overtime emergency, and your labor line alone is $175,000 to $230,000 annually. That's before a single horse is fed. Feed and bedding. A boarded horse at a full-service facility costs $400 to $700 a month in direct materials, hay, grain, shavings, supplements. Multiply by 30 horses, and you're at $12,000 to $21,000 a month. In drought years, when hay prices spike, or in winter, when horses need 20% more feed, that number climbs further. You do not control hay prices. You are at the mercy of the agricultural commodity market. Maintenance. A barn is a building full of animals that generate waste, damage walls, kick stall doors loose, and are generally hard on infrastructure. Budget $1,000 to $2,000 a month for routine repairs, and you'll still have quarters where a tractor breaks or a roof section goes, and the number doubles. Arena footing, the material in your riding rings, degrades with use and needs refreshing every few years at $5,000 to $15,000 per arena, depending on size. Utilities. Water for 30 horses, wash stalls, arena drainage, and staff facilities runs high. Electricity for lighting, heating, and automatic systems. Trash and manure hauling, which is not a small line item. A 30-stall barn generates roughly 50 pounds of manure per horse per day, which is 1,500 pounds a day, which is nearly 550,000 pounds a year. Someone has to move it. It costs money. Add it all up: labor, feed, bedding, insurance, maintenance, utilities, manure management, and a 30-stall facility is spending $25,000 to $40,000 a month before the mortgage or the lease payment. That's your baseline cost to simply exist. Everything above that is profit, nothing below it is viable. Now you might be wondering, given these numbers, how does anyone lose? The answer is instructive, and it always comes down to the same 2 mistakes. Mistake 1, overpaying for the property and carrying too much debt. In 1990, Calumet Farm was the most celebrated thoroughbred breeding operation in American history. Founded by the Wright family, of Calumet baking powder fame, the 880-acre Kentucky farm had produced Triple Crown winners, 8 Kentucky Derby champions, and a reputation that Ford Motor Company once used in television ads as a synonym for American excellence. Then J.T. Lundy took over management after the founder's widow died in 1982 and proceeded to take out $65 million in mortgages. Most of it used to purchase two stallions, Secreto and Mogambo, who had impressive pedigrees but turned out to be disasters in the breeding shed. To keep the operation afloat, Lundy borrowed more. To borrow more, he pre-sold breeding rights to Calumet's star stallion, Alydar, one of the most celebrated racehorses of his generation, collecting cash up front for seasons years in advance. By October 1990, Calumet was losing nearly $1 million a month and facing a $15 million debt payment it couldn't make. The farm was $127 million in debt. 1 month later, Alydar was found in his stall with a broken leg. 2 days after that, Alydar was euthanized, and Calumet collected $36.5 million in insurance, the largest equine insurance payout in history. In July 1991, Calumet Farm filed for bankruptcy. The farm was sold at auction in 1992 for $19 million, less than a fifth of its debt load. Lundy was convicted of bribery and fraud in 2000 and served 4.5 years in federal prison. The lesson is not subtle. Calumet was a phenomenally profitable operation destroyed by a single variable: debt service on overpriced assets. When revenue couldn't keep pace with the financing costs, there was no margin left to absorb any shock at all. Mistake 2. Building the whole business around a single asset you don't control. This is the version of the story most small, stable owners face. Not $127 million in debt, but a head trainer who leaves and takes 15 clients with them. Or a senior boarder whose horse dies and who stops boarding entirely. Or the one client who accounts for 30% of your lesson revenue and moves to a bigger facility 20 minutes down the road. In a business with high fixed costs and inherently sticky relationships, the worst structural risk isn't a bad year. It's a good client base concentrated in too few people. Here's the strange part: the people who survived the great equine industry collapse of the late 1980s, when thoroughbred values crashed and dozens of Kentucky operations went under alongside Calumet, did so almost entirely because they had diversified income streams and low debt. Boring, methodical boarding operations with lesson programs and modest mortgages weathered a crash that wiped out leveraged empires. The business rewards patience and punishes ambition. Which brings us to the darkest story in the history of equestrian sports. The scandal began, as these things often do, with money and a dead horse. In 1982, a Florida attorney named James Druck owned a promising show jumper called Henry the Hawk, ridden by his 17-year-old daughter Lisa. Druck had taken out a $150,000 insurance policy on the horse, but the highest offer he could find for a sale was $125,000. That $25,000 gap was apparently enough. Druck hired a former rodeo cowboy named Tommy Burns to electrocute Henry the Hawk in his stall. The death was ruled colic. The insurance paid out. Burns went on to kill at least 10 horses that way, and possibly dozens more, on behalf of trainers, facility owners, and wealthy riders throughout the show jumping circuit over the following decade. The method was specific: a livestock prod applied in a way that mimicked the cardiovascular signature of a natural death, making veterinary pathology nearly impossible. When the animal was worth more dead than alive, because the market had turned, or the horse was past its peak, or the owner needed cash, the call would go to Burns. In 1990, George Lindemann Jr., heir to a cellular communications fortune, hired Burns to electrocute a show jumper named Charisma in a Greenwich, Connecticut stable called Cellular Farms, in order to collect $250,000 in insurance. In 1995, Lindemann was convicted of 3 counts of wire fraud. He was sentenced to 33 months in federal prison. By the time the FBI built its case in the early 1990s, triggered originally by the 1977 disappearance of candy heiress Helen Brock, who investigators believed had threatened to expose fraudulent horse dealings and been murdered for it, 36 people were arrested. 35 were convicted. The people indicted included owners, trainers, and show organizers from some of the most prestigious equestrian facilities in the country. The FBI called it, without hyperbole, one of the biggest scandals in the history of American sports. The survival rules for the people who stayed clean through all of this are straightforward, and they apply equally to the fraud cases, and the bankruptcy cases, and the ordinary slow-motion failure cases. Rule 1. Never bet the operation on a single horse, a single client, or a single revenue source. The stall is not the product. The ecosystem is. Rule 2. Keep debt below 40% of asset value and never pledge future revenue, lesson income, breeding rights, training fees, as collateral for current borrowing. This is exactly how Calumet lost $127 million. The moment you've sold next year's income to pay this year's bill, you've lost. Rule 3. Insure everything, but understand what insurance actually covers. Care, custody, and control policies protect you when a horse in your care dies or is injured through negligence. General liability covers the human beings. Neither policy protects you from a year of empty stalls, which is the actual existential threat. Rule 4. Know your headcount math cold. Your facility breaks even when a specific number of stalls are occupied. At a 30-stall barn with $30,000 a month in fixed overhead, if your net contribution per occupied stall is $600 after variable costs, you break even at 50 stalls, which is more stalls than you have. The math has to work before you open, not after you've bought the property. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question. How much money do you make if you do this right? Scenario 1. The small operator. You buy a 15-stall facility in a mid-market equestrian area for $1.1 million, $300,000 down, $800,000 financed at a 7% commercial rate, which is roughly $5,300 a month in debt service. You run the barn yourself with one part-time stable hand, which saves you the barn manager's salary. You charge $950 per month for full care board, run 12 lessons a week at $70 each, and have 2 horses in training. At 80% occupancy, 12 horses, your monthly revenue is $11,400 in board, $3,360 in lessons, $1,200 in training fees. Total, $15,960 a month. Variable costs at $500 per horse, $6,000. Fixed costs, insurance, utilities, maintenance, part-time labor, feed markup losses, another $5,000. Debt service, $5,300. Net, negative $340 a month. You've bought yourself a very expensive job with no salary and a small monthly deficit. The path to profitability is adding a full lesson program, increasing board to 14 or 15 horses, and eventually replacing the part-time hand with a more structured training operation that generates margin. Payback period at break-even, 7 to 10 years. Net profit once the operation is mature and the mortgage is a decade in. $40,000 to $60,000 a year on your labor. The appeal is the lifestyle, not the yield. Scenario 2. The mid-market operator. You purchase a 30-stall facility with an established client base for $3.2 million, $800,000 down, $2.4 million financed. Debt service, $16,000 a month. You inherit a head trainer and a barn staff. At 85% occupancy, 25 horses, charging $1,300 per month average board, plus a lesson program generating $15,000 a month and a training program bringing in $12,000. Your total monthly revenue is around $59,500. Monthly operating costs, labor, feed, bedding, insurance, maintenance, utilities, $35,000. Debt service, $16,000. Net, $8,500 a month, or about $102,000 a year. Payback period on your $800,000 down payment, factoring in the equity you're building in the asset, roughly 8 years.